Welcome everyone to our Wednesday class that shall not be named. We're here today with some wonderful people as always. So I want to welcome, of course, Ron and Arlene and Eva and David and Michael. And I know Arnold is on YouTube and a few others on YouTube. So welcome guys. I hope you guys are ready to have a lot of fun today. Hope everybody had a great Mother's Day for all the mothers out there.
Yeah.
I gave my wife the present that just keeps giving.
But you can't keep giving her not the Star Wars, the other one.
Star Trek.
Yeah, you keep giving her presents from.
Right. Well, this time what I did is I took my kids out of town. So that's the gift that keeps on giving.
Certainly better than an iron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, an iron I think would be a really poor choice, and I probably would not regret that one. Yeah. But I hope everybody's doing well. Hope everyone had a good Mother's Day. Looking forward to all the wonderful things coming up. Hope everybody's ready to have a great summer. Is anybody doing anything exciting, by the way? All right. No excitement.
Every day is an exciting day.
That's right, Ron. That's how you look at it. Every day is exciting.
Well, we're going to New York for 10 days, so I don't know how exciting that'll be. But
Wear your body armor.
Be careful, yes.
Yeah, that's what everybody says.
Are you going for fun, or are you going to go visit family, or both?
Well, we'll see some family, but my wife is having a special birthday, and she decided that some of her friends who she hasn't seen in a long time, she'd like to see them. So we're gonna go up there, and we'll do some things. We're gonna go to the Tenement Museum.
Oh, that's great.
Haven't been there, and
it's very cool.
Maybe if we have time, we'll catch a ball game. But other than that, I'm looking forward to Katz's, which is near the Tenement.
Oh, yes.
I would go to Second Avenue Deli because it's kosher.
That's right. Second Avenue is really the best.
And it's on Third Avenue.
Yeah, they moved.
That's right.
Yeah, it's on Third, but it's the most expensive meal I ever had because we went on our honeymoon to New Zealand. We had an 8-hour layover in New York. So the one thing we did was go to Second Avenue Deli. My wife had never been there. So it cost me the cab ride there, the cab ride back.
Wow.
It was worth it. But we also drove around just a little bit so we could saw a little bit. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great time. Are you going to see any plays as well?
No, we don't have time for that. It's almost like a business trip. I mean, we both grew up there, so it's not.
Yeah,
but we don't go there very often now.
Well,
yeah, but I wish we had time to see a play. That would have been good.
Yeah,
maybe we'll. Who knows?
An extra day. Who knows? All right. So what we're going to do today? By the way, I think we're going to see my mother-in-law and my family in Texas. So it'll be fun, but nothing too exciting. We're going to look at a couple women today as we finish looking at influential women of the 20th century who were Jewish. Okay, we've done a bunch. And then we'll talk a little bit about maybe some of the ones we know personally, because the ones we're talking about, of course, are famous. But the ones that we know about maybe are not as famous, but have had a lot of influence as well. So, of course, and especially in recent years, she's become legendary. So RBG, if you get your initials and you know who you are, you're either a rapper or apparently a Supreme Court justice. So RBG is both a rapper and a Supreme Court justice, became more famous as the justice, but I hear she was an amazing rapper. So obviously she has been instrumental in so many ways, but we know her because she was so famous. Many things we loved about her. There's always divisive parts, especially when you're so famous and you become a Supreme Court justice. But we're going to talk a little bit about her, and some of you may have even met her. I never did. but obviously one of the most influential women, Jewish women of the 20th century, going well into the 21st century. She actually became the longest serving Jewish Supreme Court judge in the 21st century. But she is obviously a trailblazer for so many reasons. Very similar in some ways to Henrietta Szold, in that she was very brilliant and that she was in areas or fields or schools where it was completely dominated by men. The difference was, of course, the time period where Henrietta Szold, we're talking 1890s, early 1900s, 1910s, was a time where women were not yet ready to make the step forward that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did. But of course, during Henrietta Szold's time, women did get the right to vote. But Henrietta Szold was in these areas with women, with men, but it was basically, we're letting you in the door because you're brilliant beyond compare, but don't think any other women can do this. And it was very well known to her. She wasn't going to go to the rabbinical school. She's editing books and articles and journals and publishing, but she was not going any farther than that, which is different than, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose real first name was actually Joan, by the way. She is very similar to other women who were raised in America, who were Jewish, raised in the 30s. Her parents were from Eastern Europe. So again, she is first generation born. And like so many others, she became American very quickly. So she went to a conservative synagogue, wasn't particularly religious. They didn't have bat mitzvahs back then, but she was part of the synagogue. So she did know a little Hebrew, but she did also know she was Jewish. She went to summer camp, Jewish summer camp. She was a counselor at summer camp. She really saw that there were struggles in the Jewish world for women. And as she did throughout her life, she fought against it even early on, trying to ensure that women would have more rights in the Jewish world, which of course she was very thrilled that the Reform and Conservative movement were accepting women rabbis and women cantors, and women could be on the bima, women could have a bat mitzvah. That was something she was very excited about, even though it was late for her. She was, as we can understand, brilliant from the beginning. Her mom really stressed education, and she really wanted her to get a good education so she could become of course, teacher. She wanted her to be a teacher. And obviously she was a failure, her mother, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg never became a history teacher. However, I think we know she did do some good things, however. So teachers are wonderful and essential, but obviously to be the second woman to be on the Supreme Court was really unique. So she went to Cornell. She was I didn't realize that there was an AE Phi sorority that far back, but there was. I thought it was a newer story. So she was in a Jewish sorority. I know when I was going to the University of Texas, AE Phi was one of the 3 Jewish sororities, so I'd heard of it. And while there, she met her future husband, Martin Ginsburg. So they obviously get married because obviously her name is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, unless she met another guy whose last name is Ginsburg, which in the Jewish world is actually not so uncommon. So she studied at Cornell, was a great student, the highest ranking woman in her class, and she married Martin soon after graduating. So where do you go after graduating for Cornell? You go to, of course, Oklahoma. And she went to Oklahoma because obviously her husband had to serve, was serving in the military. So they went there for a while. She worked at the Social Security Administration, but then she went to Harvard Law School. And the percentage of Jews there was very small, like under two. Women was like under 2%. So she was one of the very few women at Harvard Law. And this quote, which became famous, I think, one of the Jewish law professors, actually, I'm not sure, it's one of the law professors there brought the few women into his room for a dinner at the, and what is the first thing he says? Why did you guys come here? You do realize you're taking the place that could be used for a man? So who knows if that's an urban legend or not, but it's very famous. But again, what do you do when so she then graduated from Columbia, not for that reason, because her husband got a job in New York. And so she graduated. So she was the first woman to be in the major law review of Harvard and Columbia, which is pretty impressive. But no matter how impressive she was, and we're talking, right before 1959, she graduates from Columbia Law School. And what's the difficult proposition for her now after being so brilliant in law school?
Getting a job.
That's right, getting a job. She's the most brilliant woman. And that was very problematic. Today would sound ridiculous, thank goodness. But she had trouble getting a clerkship anywhere. Famously, Felix Frankfurter rejected her, even though she got great recommendations. She finally went to clerk under Judge Palmieri, who I never heard of, obviously, but she clerked there basically because a law professor basically begged and said, if you don't take this woman, you're not getting anybody from Columbia ever. And if you take her and she's terrible, I promise we'll get you somebody else. And so the judge took this woman to be his clerk under these circumstances. And obviously, she did get to keep the position for the full 2 years. So, but it's really funny to think about that today, where you have to get a prominent law professor from even Harvard or Columbia to talk to the judge and say, I know she's a woman, but she's really amazing. And then when the judge says no, you threaten the judge. I think I said this Columbia because you'll never get another Columbia grad at to work for you. So again, she was really brilliant from the beginning. She worked for a Columbia Law School. She went to Sweden as part of her working for the international project she was on. She loved it over there. She realized that in Europe, women were integrated into law faster than they are here. So it was really, she said, transforming to see what is possible. And I don't think women were, 50%, but they were certainly higher than 2% or less than 2%. And so she was over there for a while. She came back with this understanding, and she actually received a position at Rutgers as a law professor, which was really quite thrilling, I'm sure. However, as we can imagine, she was paid less. That was one of the famous things. Why was she paid less? It wasn't only because she was a woman, it was because, well, you have a husband who has a really good job. So that's why she was paid less. So as one of the few women law professors in the country, for 10 years, she taught there. She helped to start the Women's Rights Law Reporter that focused on women's issues. Then she taught at Columbia, the first tenured woman ever there. So this is a woman who was brilliant. Rutgers, Columbia, Stanford. She is already in the perfect time period as well. Whereas people like Henrietta Szold were too early, she is graduating law school at the perfect time if she wants to fight for women's rights. Because the 60s, you have the fight for civil rights, and the 70s is really when the women's movement comes into its own and really starts to make, I mean, it's been going on for years, but really starts to make major changes. And she's right there, along with Gloria Steinem. She wasn't as famous then yet, but so well respected. She founded the Women's Rights Project for the ACLU, and she argued gender cases on discrimination before the Supreme Court. I can't imagine the Supreme Court heard that many women who came into the court and were able to represent. So, and she was generally targeting women's rights on many levels, including, changing words from sex to gender, little things even like that. But again, her career continued to blossom, and, not only women's rights, but other issues as well, obviously. She was very supportive of Roe versus Wade, as we can imagine. She thought it was limiting in some ways, but she did not represent on that one. But of course, there were other ones. And, with her career as a lawyer, her writings, her working for the ACLU, she eventually became very good friends with Scalia, who obviously would eventually be on the Supreme Court with her, and was really someone who could work with people on both sides. Even though she was more a Democrat politically, she was more a center. And so very happy apparently to work with people on the other side as often as possible. Now, in 1978, Congress basically said we need more judges. And so that opened the door for a lot of people and few women. And so she is nominated and becomes a judge under Jimmy Carter, who was somebody who really wanted to do this. So she became one of the early female federal judges. And we're so proud in Georgia that it was our president from our state who was the one who plucked her out of Stanford Law School and made her a judge at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and then later for another circuit as well. So this was obviously a great moment for her, for women, for Jews to have. Now, she wasn't the first woman to be put on court. Actually, we had a member of our congregation who was like the third in the country to be doing that. Maybe we'll talk about her. But as we know, she became a very moderate voice from a left side. And that was really what endeared her to so many. And that's why on my birthday, 1993, she became the second woman to become a Supreme Court justice, which must have been scintillating. I was 24 at the time, so I wasn't paying attention to these things. But I mean, how incredible it must have been. And by the way, at that time, there were no Jewish justices. There hadn't been a Jewish Supreme Court justice in almost 25 years. So she was the second woman, the first Jewish person since the 60s, which was really, and of course, she'll eventually become the longest serving Jewish one. What's really amazing about our country is a few years ago, our country was founded by Protestants, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and we were a Protestant country. I mean, for people left to find, freedom here as Protestants, but I don't know, maybe it was like 20 years ago. If you would have looked at the Supreme Court, there was exactly 0 Protestants on the Supreme Court. David, you probably know more about this than me. They were
No,
all
that's true. Only Catholics and Jews.
Jews, right, Catholics and Jews. That's not the case today, but that speaks a lot about America. Now, of course, we have women. We do have Protestants now, so it's really great to have seen that happen. And obviously, she became very renowned, especially later on during her tenure there. She was a staunch liberal in many ways, but also willing to work with the other side. So she was, again, middle of the road, which is obviously what we probably need more of. And obviously, her best friend on the court was Scalia, and they were very famous because you had a Republican nominated and a Democrat nominated who basically are very close, did their lunches together, and probably she was closer to him and he to her than anybody who was a Democrat or Republican on their side, which I think was really cool. So, but during her tenure, she was always still the second woman on the court until Sandra Day O'Connor retired in 2006, and then she became the only woman on the court. And this is really, she made her mark in many ways. Obviously, we've had, Sotomayor and Kagan since, or Coggin since, but she became not only the only woman, but at one point the longest serving person. So she became the senior member of the court. And during those last years, she really became an icon in many respects for her willingness to work with the other side, for her foresight. In many ways, she looked at women's rights laws as being too limiting, so she didn't always support some of them when you thought she would. Obviously, she supported abortion rights and all that, but she was very famous for being able to work both sides. And then obviously, we could go over all the court cases, but I don't understand most of them. So we'll let David do that next week. So David, we need you to go over every single court case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked on and gave an opinion of. All right.
I don't think I can do that, and I'm not a discrimination law expert. But one thing that was always said about her is why, in the end, it was thought that she was quite effective, but also very helpful to ultimate social stability. Is that she often made her arguments in ways that were gender neutral. It's not just women should get this, and it was very helpful in setting a framework that was workable and acceptable for people.
And that's great to hear. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but if anybody else has stories, we'll talk about it. But again, she was on the court for a very long time. Became controversial, though, of course, at the end of her career, mostly because the President of the United States and everybody asked her to retire. They wanted her to retire during the Obama administration, when the Democratic Party, of course, controlled the Senate and the House. And she refused. She said she wanted to continue on. And many thought that she was waiting for Hillary Clinton to win in the election so that Clinton would appoint somebody she thought would be more appropriate, that she would have a woman appointing somebody to replace her. And of course, that did not happen. So that brought some angst with a lot of the liberal movement, because obviously she died and a Republican president placed her. So that was something she probably would not have wanted. So even though she's a legend, that's kind of stained her reputation just a little bit in the Democratic world, but really not very much. I mean, she's considered one of the great women of the 20th century and 21st century. She's married to a very prominent man who was a giant in his world as a tax attorney. However, you got to give credit to him. It's not every man in the 1950s and 60s who was that much of an intellect, who was willing to, move to where his wife is going, to take a second seat to someone who is going to be even more famous and more renowned. And so you have to give him credit. Today, I don't think it's as big of a deal, but it still is. I think there's still a lot of very prominent men out there who would not be willing to take the second seat to their wife. And certainly in the 50s and 60s, even more so. So really a lot of kudos to him for doing that. Now, as for her, we all know she was also really strong because she dealt with cancer time and again. She had multiple bouts with cancer throughout her life. Her mother died from cancer, and she was able to fight through, 5 times or more, and really recovered, obviously, until the end. She, as I mentioned, she was never a religious Jew. She was not going to services at the Reform or Conservative congregations, but she was very proud of her Judaism and very happy, again, that women were able to lead services in conservative Reform synagogues, very happy that they were able to, men and women were able to sit together during services. So that was something that she really was very supportive of. So after all these years, obviously, she died very recently at 87 in 2020. And funny enough, she died on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And so continues to be an incredibly well beloved person in our community, in the world, even for people on the other side of the political sphere. And then, of course, towards the end of her life, like the last year, she became even more famous because they had that great documentary on her that really went viral and really made her more of a pop star. It's funny that she became like a pop star cultural icon at 85. And that's really what happened to her. Everybody knew who she was, but really, I think the last couple of years of her life, and then after she has died, she's become really this pop icon. And, there's exhibitions going around about all the time. The movie, I don't know if it was nominated for Academy Award or anything, but it became really popular. It was actually, I think, first shown at the museum in LA. There's an LA that is was founded by the Reform movement. It's the Skirball Cultural Center. So anybody have any thoughts on her? You can imagine that if Andy Warhol were here today, he would have done that iconic color 3 things of her. Anybody else? David.
I have a personal note, although it shows that I'm 1 degree of separation from her rather than an actual connection. But when I was, in addition to, the fact that she had, in terms of her personal life, she had 2 children, and she was very active in raising them. One was a daughter and one was a son. The daughter, Jane Ginsburg, when I was at law school on the Law Review and wrote a note, Jane Ginsburg was my editor. So I worked very closely with her. And that was a great experience because when in university you write papers, but no one edits you really. You get some comments, but worked closely for months with her. And she had been an English major at Chicago, so she was really very helpful, I think, in helping me develop, a sense that when you write, you try to avoid legalese and. She was a very helpful editor. She's had a very successful career, not as famous as her mother, but she's one of the leading intellectual property lawyers at Columbia. So I was always disappointed because at some point, there was supposed to be some kind of social thing set up so I would meet her mother, but it never happened.
Man. So close, and is she still at Columbia today?
She's I think she may be a professor emerita. She's still she's over normal retirement age, but I think she's still head of the intellectual property project at Columbia.
Wow, not too shabby.
No.
Anybody else have any thoughts on her? I mean, again, what can you say? about RBG. If you get an acronym, then you're doing pretty well, I think. So we're going to now go to another woman that I meant to talk about earlier, but we didn't have a chance to, and that was Hedy Lamarr. So another icon, not as famous today probably as she could have been in many ways because how Hollywood portrayed her, but obviously we know what she did and how posthumously she's had an effect beyond her career as an actress. So I don't know if any of you have heard of her. Probably all of you have.
Oh, yeah.
She was born in Vienna and she was Jewish. And Vienna is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. And she grows up and she becomes very enthralled with acting. And so she becomes an actress at an early age and becomes pretty popular as an actress. She's beautiful. She wins beauty contests, but she's also brilliant. But obviously that's not the time, probably best to be brilliant in a woman in Europe at this time. And so she is this famous actress. However, she becomes very famous because she's in kind of this very erotic movie. So she's done movies, she's extras on movies, she does the usual thing. She starts up, she's in theater, and she goes to Berlin, where probably there's the center of movies and theater in the world she lives in. She meets a Russian theater producer. She's, in lead roles. She's in comedies. She's in dramatic roles, and she becomes very famous. And this is, before she's even 18. Obviously, they probably didn't have the laws restricting how many hours a 15-year-old girl can perform. So she's very famous by the time she's 18. And she becomes even more famous because she's in the famous movie Ecstasy. And this is the famous movie as she is the young wife to an older guy. And it shows her a little bit of nudity, shows her engaged in the act. And she is very famous for this, but it plagues her a little bit that she's famous for this type of role. But plus, as you can imagine, she gets a lot of negative publicity because of this, because she's in these erotic movie, and it's 1933. And who's taking power in 1933? Adolf Hitler, and she is Jewish, very well known as being Jewish in many circles. So she is just still very famous. She ends up dating one of the richest men in Europe, and his name is Frederick Mandel. He's charming. Think about, anybody see obviously the movie with Barbra Streisand, just forgetting the name, in the 60s, made her famous, Funny Girl. Everybody saw Funny Girl, and she falls in love with Omar Sharif. He's like this suave, international guy, and she falls in love with him. The difference is he becomes kind of a little weird in some ways, whereas the guy who falls in love with Hedy Lamarr is a little different. So he is an arms merchant. He is rich. He is connected to Benito Mussolini. He's connected to Adolf Hitler. And yet he's dating, and she's dating, and she's only 18. And he is a very aggressive, controlling husband, and basically does not want her to act. She said she basically was a prisoner in her house. So it's a very difficult circumstance for this one, especially because Hitler is now taking over. Mussolini. Mandel is very connected, even though he's part Jewish. So she is forced to go with him to meetings. But during these meetings, she actually gets to talk with people who are in the science fields, because he's a munition expert. So she gets to talk technology. Obviously, people want to talk. Yes, Ron.
Some of her inventions
Right, we're going to talk about.
are still used today by the military.
That's right. We're going to talk about. And this is where she gets her father was technology. But just imagine you're a scientist and you're meeting with a conference or meeting at these things, and then all of a sudden, who wants to talk to you about science? This one of the most beautiful women, this 18-year-old actress who's famous, and all of a sudden you get to talk to Hedy Lamarr. I mean, can you imagine who is at these conferences? It's all men. It's all scientists and munitions, sellers and rich people. And then all of a sudden he brings this girlfriend, and it's Hedy Lamarr. So I'm sure everybody there would talk to her about anything she wanted them to talk about, because she's, they don't take her seriously as a scientist, but I mean, she's just a Hollywood star in Europe. So they marry, but she decides to separate, and while living in Paris, she escapes. That's how she takes all the jewelry with her, but she basically escapes Paris. She said he was basically referred to her as his doll. So she escapes Paris, goes to London, and in London, who does she meet? Another Jewish guy, Louis B. Mayer, who's in London, and what's he doing? He's scouting talent. And she's still 21 at the time, 22, 23. Michael, do you want to say something? And you're on mute. Oh, you didn't? So Louis B. Mayer, who was the most famous movie studio head, probably the most powerful man in movies, meets her and brings her to America. And he actually offers her a certain amount of money. She wants 4 times the amount, which she eventually persuades him to do. He changes her name to Hedy Lamarr, and in 1938 comes to America, and she's already in America, and he now promotes her as the most beautiful woman in America, maybe the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, so she comes to America, and she immediately, English is pretty good, gets the lead in a pretty well-known movie. Then she gets the lead in another movie, and she becomes very popular, very well-known. She's kind of this temptress. She is what they believe is going to be, who are the most famous European actresses of the time? There's 2 of them, Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich. And they promote her as the next one. So she's beyond beautiful. However, she never achieves that type of fame. She becomes famous and obviously a Hollywood starlet, but from the very early on, she's in Spencer Tracy movies, but eventually she seems to be put into the role of the femme fatale, or the seductress. Think of her as Samson Delilah. Not her most famous movie, but Delilah is probably the best way to represent what she is. So she's in all these movies. She's with Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy and James Stewart. So she does become very famous, She gets top billing, but their movies are making money, but she's also playing more the exotic dancer, the queen, the temptress. So she gets pretty much set into one type of role. And so she's beautiful, she's sensual, but obviously she gets a little bored because she's continually in the same roles all the way into the 1940s. And what is ironic is she's brilliant and she's sophisticated and she's, magnetic with her personality, but she was also more of a loner. I mean, she had a terrible relationship in Europe. She's going from one movie to the other. How women were, even though she's a starlet, she's not quite to the level of the greatest ones. And so she also has trouble assimilating to American culture. And plus, she sees what's going on in Europe. I mean, in the 40s, her family's in Europe. And that had to be really difficult. And so this is what was going on. But she did do a lot of fundraising for war efforts. I think she wanted especially help with war bonds. She's a celebrity. She escaped Europe. She doesn't, nobody, in the Hollywood world, nobody knew she was Jewish. I mean, she was Jewish, but it's like you didn't promote yourself as being Jewish. So she's going around as a woman from this area of the world promoting Americans fighting where she's coming from, which was probably very helpful to have this beautiful woman, exotic, famous actress, saying, we need to fight my old country because it is controlled by terrible despots. So that was really amazing for her. Obviously, her most famous role would later become Samson and Delilah, in which she played opposite Victor Mature. It won 2 Oscars. It was one of the most popular movies of 1950. And then obviously she continued to act after that for years, all the way into the 50s. I'm sure we saw some of the movies. None of them were to the level there because, as we know, in Hollywood, as women become a certain age, she was 18 in 1933, so she's already 38 years old in 1953. And so obviously women were not getting, you don't get roles when you're that age in Hollywood unless you're playing the mother or, and I mean, it happened to all women. It wasn't like particularly against her. So her, she continued to be in movies in the 50s, but then she basically retired. And she did a couple movies later on, but really, you can go online and see the list of movies she did. So she was a famous actress. How many of you heard of her when you were, I don't know if any of you heard of her when you were in the 50s? Was she popular? Was she well known?
Yeah,
Ron?
absolutely. Yeah, she was very popular. The thing is that she was a physicist when she was in Europe.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that now. Ron, continue.
Yeah, and the thing is that, she never got really the credit that she deserved for her work in that field.
And that is exactly, and again, she was a woman, and that was a real problem. Her husband was an arms dealer and really rich and a male chauvinist pig. So now, the only time I really heard about her until, the last 20 or 30 years as adults, I mean, obviously I saw Samson Delilah, but I mean, they make reference to her in some of the Mel Brooks movies, and that's obvious. Mel Brooks probably knew her or knew of her, knew she was Jewish. So so now I am not a scientist, unlike some of you, but she is not an officially trained scientist. She did not go to school to be a scientist. Her father was a scientist or a technical worker, but she became a self-taught scientist. She did things like creating her own carbonated drink, or a way to make carbonated drinks better, a way to make the traffic stoplights better. But she became very famous, and obviously I am not well understanding it, but with producing frequency hopping spread spectrum or something like that. I don't understand, but she patented ways to make radar better. I think that's what really became so. And this became something later on, years later, because they didn't have the technology at first to really help, especially in many ways. So she couldn't get the stuff into the military during World War II, but later on, of course, it became her inventions or discoveries became used in radar technology. I think that's where it became, and maybe the internet, stuff like that. That's where it became very famous. So her discoveries, her inventions, her theories, her mathematical computations helped really create radar and maybe even the internet and the connection between satellites. Somebody can go and look and do more study on that and explain it to me, because I don't understand it all. But I probably could have just looked it up online and figured it out. But remember, she was a woman, so she was going to be shunned, and she had to hire basically lawyers to get any credit at all for her work. And it really probably was very difficult. Now, of course, she's famous for it. I mean, Wi-Fi is based on her ideas, but at the time, obviously, she was ignored, and at the time, obviously, Wi-Fi was not capable. But it's amazing to think that Wi-Fi, which came in recent years, is based on the computations of a Jewish actress in the 1930s and 40s that never went to school for it. I mean, that's pretty amazing. She did get some credit later on in life for it, but obviously not the credit she deserved. Now, as for her later years, obviously she stopped acting pretty much in the 60s. She had some mental breakdowns later on in life. She got caught for shoplifting a lot of times. She married a couple of times.
6
and
times.
Huh?
I just looked at Google.
How
and
many
she
times?
married 6 times.
6 times, which was probably not uncommon for Hollywood starlets, but she also had she did not choose always the best men to marry. But she also became a recluse in the later years, not quite to the degree of, Greta Garbo, but she really did become more of a recluse. She only really came back into the media when she sued Mel Brooks for using her name in one of his movies. So in a movie, he referred to Hedley Lamar, and she said, I think she lost the lawsuit. She said, she gave a right to privacy lawsuit or whatever. But other parts of her technologies also ended up being in different inventions. So she was always, her lawyers were suing for control of her technology, for suing for what she created. But again, she really, the last year, she stayed at home and really only spoke to people on the phone. But she is still an incredibly famous person. And obviously, her time as a starlet, she got the Hollywood Walk of Fame. She was a major actress, late 30s, 40s, and 50s. And really, the technology, which in her later years became more famous, she became more well-known for discovering this, especially when she started to sue people who were using her technology without permission. But again, an incredible Jewish woman who lived an incredible life, and really some very wonderful moments, but obviously a lot of difficult ones because of mostly the men she married. And I'm going to look for her husbands. 6 times. That's a lot. and she was married for, at the most, longest marriage lasted 7 years. A Texas oil man. So her last divorce was 1965. So she died in 2000. So for 35 years, she stayed single. But yes, Michael.
How was she involved in Jewish community at all? Did she identify in later life as a Jew?
She did identify. She didn't do much in the Jewish community, I don't think. And obviously, she became recluse later in life. But I think, it's probably very difficult for someone to come to America and be a famous actress. But she also had a very, she had an accent, which you could, although her English was excellent. I mean, her English is perfect, but she definitely had the accent. It was a sexy accent, obviously, but you're coming from Europe and all the persecution there in the 30s. You have this accent of what many people would probably think is a German accent. It kind of was a German-esque, obviously it's Austrian, but very similar if you're listening with an American ear. So, and you're in Hollywood as a starlet wanting to be a lead actress, and probably the only female lead actress of her level who's Jewish. I mean, there were men, but even in men, most of the lead men actors were comedians. She was not a comedian, except for maybe there was a couple of guys, but very few. So she really never did anything Jewish, I don't think, in her life. I think she stayed quiet about it and just kind of, she never converted to another religion. But I don't think, and you guys may know differently, but I don't think she was, I don't think any, except for her first husband. I don't know if any of her husbands were even Jewish. Her first husband was partially Jewish, even though he was an anti-Semite. But I don't know what she did. I don't think she did anything Jewishly. She was in Samson and Delilah. Of course, she played the non-Jewish part. So I've been in one play. I was in the JCC production of Fiddler on the Roof in the 90s. And it's a big production. I mean, there are a lot of actors in it. And out of all of them, there were only 3 who were Jewish. Me, the guy who played Tevye, and one of the little girls who played one of the daughters. I, of course, played the Russian police officer. So I was the non-Jewish communist kicking out the non-Jewish Jews from Anatevka. So it was, but obviously, I mean, they typecast me because obviously I'm very intimidating. That's why. The real reason they gave me that part was they were desperate for male actors because a lot of them were at this there was something else going on, and it was the only non-singing part. So that's how I got it. So this is Hedy Lamarr, an incredible woman, recluse for the last 30 years of her life. She was not a recluse like Greta Garbo. I mean, she did talk to people. She was on the phone, and she was suing people a lot because of her technology, and she was accepting guests and stuff. So it wasn't as much as like a Greta Garbo, but pretty much stayed to herself. And again, she had marriages, but they were not, I don't think, happy marriages, and they were very short-lived. Any thoughts? Do you guys remember any movie from her? Any of the movies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the names, but we saw, Arlie and I, we saw a lot of her movies. And I think that mainly she played parts as a femme fatale.
Yeah, that's what she became. And I don't think she wanted that, but I think because of her accent, I mean, and she was so good at it, that unfortunately, unlike Greta Garbo, although her career was longer by far than Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo, both of them ended early, and hers extended longer, but that accent and just her way just put her in that position. But again, she was lucky to be acting at all, really. She escaped Europe. She escaped from her husband, but also the film she did at 18, if she did that in America, probably would have ruined her career. I mean, she still would have done movies, but she wouldn't have been doing Hollywood A-list movies. So by moving to America, no Americans didn't know about the movie Ecstasy that had made her so famous in Europe. They just knew she was a famous European starlet, I think. But I have not. I mean, I may have seen some of her movies. I am not seen a lot of them. She did the famous movie Algiers, which was one of her early movies. That was pretty well known. She did I Take This Woman with Spencer Tracy. She did Lady in the Tropics. She did Boomtown with Clark Gable. And she did Come Live With Me with Jimmy Stewart. So she was Robert Young, William Powell, I mean, Walter Pidgeon. So she's playing the woman femme fatale lead in a lot of movies. You can only imagine she probably was on the list to maybe get Casablanca. She didn't get Casablanca, but she got a movie that tried to mimic Casablanca, which, that's futile because Casablanca, you just can't mimic. It's too good. But I can easily see her in the role of Casablanca as well. Who was the Ingrid Bergman's role? Is it Ingrid Bergman who's in Casablanca? Yeah. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I could see her in that role, but Ingrid Bergman's so good. So, I mean, what are you going to say? Any thoughts?
Arlene and I are fans of TCM, Turner Classic Movies.
Yes.
And these old movies, they're just absolutely fantastic with the acting and everything.
My mother, when we, in the 80s, when it came out, my mother in our home area, that's all she watched. She loved that. So I had to watch it with her. I did enjoy the movies. I didn't enjoy the imprisonment, though. You can watch movies with her. So I knew a lot of these. Obviously, the more famous ones, Casablanca, and what are some of the ones I really liked? All About Eve, which is also a great one. Obviously, we should do something on like Jews and these great movies. The best, of course, is Wizard of Oz, and then Casablanca. Those two are great. Sunset Boulevard. Holy cow, that is an awesome movie. That's one of the great movies because it shows the starlets as they aged and are no longer in movies, but still have money. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but that is a fabulous movie. Any other thoughts? Now, does anybody know? Now, let's real quick, we'll go over what we're going to do next because we've done a couple weeks on this. So if you have any thoughts, let me know. We just did influential women. And now we have to choose another one. Anybody have any ideas?
I think you just about hit just a couple of Jewish women, but I'm sure there are a lot more.
Like we could go back. So we'll continue with Jewish women then.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting.
We just won't do. We just did. That's right. We're still going to do Jewish women. We did influential Jewish women 3 times. So we'll go do something else. Any age or area you guys want to do?
No.
All right. So I will pick a different genre of Jewish women, and we'll continue that for a couple. We've done biblical. What we'll probably do, yes, Ron.
It may be interesting to talk about Jewish women or men who were not Jewish, but played a role in protecting Jews.
That's a great topic. Non-Jewish people.
Like Eleanor Roosevelt. When during the Second World War, when FDR brought 1,000 Jews into his country, he wanted to send them back after. Right. And it was his wife, Eleanor, that said, no, they can stay here. And awesome. He did a lot more.
Well, you could do that in terms of God, old age is terrible. The righteous Gentiles.
Right. Yeah.
During the war, like Wallenberg and there are other. Well, even Schindler.
Well, why don't we do a couple weeks on non-Jews who have supported Judaism or Jews through the years?
That's fine.
That's good.
I mean, the most famous and probably the most important would be Napoleon. I think we've talked about them before, but I'm happy to do it again.
Yeah.
All right. But certainly through the ages, certain kings and popes even have helped a lot to protect Jews. And so we can talk about individuals. We'll talk about individuals. All right, that's a great one. So instead of Jewish women, we'll talk about individuals the next couple weeks who have non-Jewish individuals who have helped the Jewish cause. All right, perfect. Excellent. Now, as for what's coming up this weekend, just a reminder, there are no services at Mikveh Israel. On Friday night and Saturday morning, the service will be at the Wesley Monumental Retreat Center. Everybody's still welcome. The retreat goes on all weekend, so you can come Friday night and Saturday for services. You can come for Friday night. People are spending the night. There's going to be, campfire and programs all day, Friday and Saturday and Sunday morning. So you can come for all of them or come for just one, but we will not have services on site at Mikveh Israel this weekend. All right. Hope to see you guys there. Should be a lot of fun. On the Saturday morning, we're going to have 3 options for types of services. On Friday night, I think we have a song session. So it should be a lot of fun. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Say hi to everybody who was not able to join us. And welcome again. And thank you to all those who are on YouTube watching us. And we will see you next week. And anything else you need, let us know, everybody. Stay safe.
Take care.
Bye.
Very good.
Bye, guys.